Okay, so I just had an idea for a story and an idea for an investigation. Basically, a couple of days ago, I saw that the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, the leader of the Australian Labor Party, had announced a minimum wage increase as part of their policy platform going into a federal election, which will happen sometime this year. The I got the impression from reading it, from when I was reading the article about it and the news that I saw, that the media's response had been overwhelmingly negative, that most of the articles that I could find online had a negative spin on this, saying that it would hurt jobs and hurt the economy and all the usual stuff that people say as arguments against raising the minimum wage. And it's also my impression that this is starkly divergent from the general public opinion, that public opinion is overwhelmingly in favor of an increase to the minimum wage. From memory, I would say that I actually remember, I'll check and see if I can find this, but I remember a poll done, I think last year, maybe the year before, in which even a majority of conservative voters in Australia wanted a raise in the minimum wage. And now the raise that Bill Shorten's suggesting is to be calculated in relation to the median wage. So he's using the term living wage, and he's saying that the minimum wage for a full-time worker should be equivalent to 60% of the median wage of a full-time worker. So what that means is no one who works a 40-hour week, or a 38-hour week rather, in Australia will be living in relative poverty. And that is something that I think the majority of Australians support, but the majority of the media seems to oppose. And if people are wondering why the media aren't trusted or why the media aren't liked and respected, the fact that they don't reflect the opinions of the community may be one factor in that. Now, a third thing to consider would be, what do the experts say? Now, my impression is that most of the meta-studies and statistical analysis and so forth has found that increases in the minimum wage don't hurt employment, because the extra spending power in the hand of employees, workers, consumers, across the economy balances out any increased cost to employers. And so now I'm going to try and check these three things. What is the press saying? What do the public think, and what do experts think? And then I'm going to try and summarize all of that and see if I can understand the institutional reasons why the press have a different perspective from these other two groups, and where the expert opinion lies on the matter. Bit of a note about the methodology. When we've got all these duplicate articles, so here we've got the Moree Champion, the Yass Tribune, the Crookwell Gazette, the Rural Blue Mountains Gazette, et cetera. These are all obviously local papers, including the Eden Magnet, which is nearby to my town is Eden, and their paper was once a proud independent local paper, now out of a big conglomerate, and they're all getting pushed. This idea about, caution about the minimum wage, watch out, which will definitely go in the negative category when I'm analyzing it. But I'm just going to count that as one article. And in fact, I'm going to change it to not show duplicates to save a bit of time. Notable aside, New Matilda, a kind of flagship paper of the Australian left, which I used to write for back in the day, doesn't even seem to have any coverage of it. Which is obviously a bit disappointing, and fits with what a lot of people say, that there's a sort of streak of the left that really don't want to see when Labor gets anything right. But that's an aside, really. That's not what I'm here to do. Actually, of course, that's why nothing even checked there, because I had used a Google News search, and I wondered if that was comprehensive enough. And I thought, well, I'll check and see if there's something on New Matilda that hasn't made it on to Google News. And there wasn't. In any case, I'm just going to use, it's not a perfect sample, but this is all the Google News articles that have the word shorten and the word minimum wage over the last week, which includes goes back to before he made the announcement. So I think I've got a decent sample size, a decent set of news articles to analyze, and New Matilda is not part of that. So here, the harm to jobs from raising a minimum wage is to me a negative phrase, and I'm going to count that as one in this article. And achieve a decent standard of living is a positive phrase. This article actually seems quite balanced at first glance, but we'll glance. We'll see. But yeah, achieve a decent standard of living is definitely a positive comment. I'm not going to keep narrating every single one of these that I find. I'm just giving these examples, and now I'll try and power through it a bit. Yeah, here we've got three essentially negative phrases in a row. Now these are sort of edge cases, and I think they're quite subtle, but I think they're still negative. And I'm highlighting that I'm putting these in the negative category just to be very clear about what my methodology is. And these are almost neutral, but I'm saying that they're negative but is a living wage really suitable for Australia? That question seems to me to imply a no, just in the way it's phrased. And unions tried and failed to get a work commission to phase in living wage tied to 60% of median earnings in 2017. I guess that's okay. Maybe I'll take that one out. And then the commission made the point that Britain has introduced its living wage from a much lower base than Australia. So that's definitely an argument against that's being voiced there. So I'm going to put that as a negative. But I'll take out the middle one. So we're up to 4. Okay, I see I stopped keeping count of the actual phrases because basically after a little bit of back and forth at the beginning, it's just an argument against the minimum wage. So I'm going to put this in the... First, let's put a new column. Against. All right. So I'm going to do that for each of the articles now. See if I basically classify them as for or against in a sort of quantitative way. How many arguments they put forward in favor and how many against. That last one, I didn't bother counting the individual phrases because the headline made its position quite clear and the body of the article was overwhelmingly in line with that, arguing against what Shorten's position was and siding with the Business Council of Australia, who are against it. Against the increase. Okay. This one at least this article is very much, it looks like it's going to be negative because it says Labor's got it all wrong. That's the headline. But it's worth noting that they at least, they acknowledge that the public is in favor of the minimum wage increase. So even if they disagree with the public, they're not being entirely tone deaf. I'm being quite charitable to them here. I think they're obviously going to say that the public is stupid for wanting that and say what they would call trickle up economics, where you give money to the poor and it stimulates the economy, doesn't work. I don't know if I'm not convinced that they've got solid economic modeling or theory to back up that claim that it doesn't work though. Potentially ruin Australian industry. Definitely overall against. Okay, this smart company article is at least nuanced enough that I'm going to have to use my tally system and see if to get an answer I can be comfortable. I'm counting here where they've quoted what Shorten says. Shorten decried the current minimum wage in a speech to level crossing workers, saying it is very hard to live off. I'm counting that as a positive because they're quoting Shorten and they're including his argument that the current minimum wage is very hard to live off. Okay, this here, the party's been on a small business warpath, definitely negative. I've included 2 on the positive side here, which are just complaints about the current system, but I'm calling that, if you say the current system's bad, then that's probably an argument in favor of. And that wrapped up with 3 more paragraphs, which are overall in favor of the Labor plan, it seems to me, or edging that way. So I'm going to call this the first in favor. I'm also just noting that the for here is a gently for rather than a hard against. Where most of the againsts have been unambiguously against, whereas the for article by Smart Company is slightly ambiguous in what it's saying. There's a lot of just reporting who said what in that one and explaining the legal mechanisms currently in place and stuff like that. So that's one that it takes a side, but only subtly, whereas the ones that take a side against so far have been quite strong. This one here by the New Daily is the first that's strongly and clearly in favour. Okay, so I might be wrong that Shorten's actually said that it would be 60% of the median wage. That's what the Australian Council of Trade Unions has called for. And actually, which is an OECD recommendation. So that's something I didn't know until I read this. So the Australian Financial Review is informing and correcting me here, and also seems to be so far positive or balanced. Okay, so there was a string of paragraphs at the top laying out the ACTU and Labor's position, and now there seems to be a string of paragraphs laying out the Liberal Party's position. So we're getting a lot of fors and a lot of against. Yeah, and in the end, they ended up having more of the arguments against aid than the arguments in favor. And they even had something about people smugglers, as in bringing immigration, repeating the Prime Minister's comments that the only wages that wouldn't increase under Labor were those of people smugglers, which is, pretty gratuitous to include that sort of tweet. Another article by the New Daily that's overwhelmingly in favour of the changes. I'm pretty sure I'm going to read through it, but I'm not keeping a clear tally on this because it seems that the angle is unambiguous. Okay, this one is about a bunch of stuff. It's not just about the minimum wage. It's about the growth outlook for the Australian economy and how that affects people. Then it kind of segues into the wage debate, and it has this much in favour and this much against. So I'm going to call it neutral. Thank you, Hepburn. Okay, so apart from these four shortish paragraphs here, and these two at the end, that's 6 paragraphs in total out of this whole article and a video at the top. Those 6 paragraphs are arguments against minimum wage increase by the current treasurer. The rest is basically a recap of what's the arguments put forward by head of the ACTU, Sally McManus, in favour of a minimum wage increase, and details about a strike. So I'm going to call this one a for, because it's voicing for opinions, even if they're not in the editorial voice. I'm actually going to have to stop for a little bit now, and I'll come back and do more. Okay, picking up roughly where I left off. So just a bit of a side note. Hold on a sec. Yeah, side note here. Shorten promises better income for workers if elected is the labelling on this video on the 9 News website, but it doesn't talk about that at all. It's just a general sort of election coverage thing about, which seats are going to be contested and how the different parties will do it in the state of Victoria. Anyhow, so I guess that's just an error in their data handling process, but that just a bit of an aside. Interesting here, 9 News, normally known traditionally as quite a conservative outlet, seems to have a positive story about the wages going up. A friend of mine has a pet theory that they've actually become more progressive since they were listed, since they had a public offering, because they were previously owned by a particular family, the Fairfax family, who therefore had a political angle which they would enforce. Whereas now, because it's thrown open to markets and it's actually controlled by the shareholders aren't as engaged in the day-to-day running, they just care about profits. The focus has moved to the focus has moved to actually just ratings and ad sales and profit. So, and to achieve that they've actually moved left, which fits with my personal experience. My dad runs a bookshop in Sydney that is, attacked in the right wing press for being left wing. And he was asked once, "Why do you sell so many left wing books? Why do you sell more left wing books than right wing books?" And he said, "Because they sell better." And that's definitely his experience and the experience of others, that actually left wing analysis is more popular in certain circumstances. So it's an interesting thing there, where left to the market, you actually get quite progressive views in the media, and that there's more political and ideological forces at work in terms of the business interests, the other business interests of owners, and so forth. I mean, that's a theory, and I just thought it was interesting to air it in the context of Channel 9 coming up with what's definitely a 4 story. This article does have a quote from Shorten putting forth the claim that the wages are growing too slowly, but it's not really an article about that, and it's buried down there, so I'm just going to leave it out. I mean, the article is actually about the per capita recession, some other economic data, and then in the final paragraph, it has one mention of wages, which I just don't think it including it is fair. Okay, so I've just had to restart my computer because this Chrome window was playing up. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to get rid of these 2 columns here, positive phrases and negative phrases, and do a tally by hand for the articles which require that level of detail. Mostly I can tell, there's a lot of the time there's no ambiguity about whether it's for or against. If it's an opinion piece, you can normally tell pretty quickly. But I'm also analyzing the reporting and whether the reporting presents the idea favorably, positively or negatively. Because I'm including that, I'm finding there's a fair few articles which I'm classing as positive, just because they include a lot of quotes from the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, which are obvious, and obviously he's in favor of it. So I'm not making any distinction between quotes in an article that are in favor of the policy and the editorial position of the paper. And similarly, if there's a quote from someone who's against it, the Business Council or other people I've seen quoted speaking against an increase in the minimum wage, I'm not distinguishing that from the editorial line of the paper. If there is an article where there's some ambiguity, I'm going to be doing a tally by hand, because doing it on the Excel spreadsheet was just probably more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so I just did a tally on this article, for example, and you'll see for got 6 and against got 5. Pardon my terrible handwriting. And that's the pattern with the positive stories, is that they are just reporting on Shorten's speech, and then they'll normally have response from the opposition and business groups pushing back against it. Because the bulk of the article is laying out Mr. Shorten's position, a lot of the time it's quoting or paraphrasing him, so it ends up being positive on balance. Okay, so that's why you do your research, because sometimes you're wrong. And I was wrong in this case, in that I thought the press were overall against the minimum wage in a sort of quantifiable way. I didn't make a distinction here between opinion and reporting pieces, because that's another level of complexity I didn't want to introduce. But what I found was there's as many for as there are against. Of the articles that showed up in my Google News search, which I did 2 days after the speech by Shorten where he indicated that the Labor Party would push for a higher minimum wage. There were 16 stories that weren't behind paywalls, that were unambiguously about that issue, and they were split between for and against, with one neutral, one where I couldn't determine any particular direction to the reporting. A lot of the four stories were simply reporting Bill Shorten's speech and therefore including a lot of quotes from Bill Shorten's speech, and therefore ended up having more arguments for the minimum wage and only a few arguments against. But that's the results are the results. So that's right, a 50-50 split. So I'm going to have to make a smaller claim. I can't say what I set out to say. I do think this it shows a divergence between the press and the public, because the public, and it's my impression, which I'm about to go check, are not split 50-50 on minimum wages. They are in favor of a minimum wage increase, is my impression. I'm going to try and find polling data on that now. Okay, so my memories did serve me correctly. There is this story from 2017 saying that not only do a strong majority of Australians support, a huge majority, 70%, that's double, more than double everyone who either disagrees or is neutral. So there's overwhelming support in the general public for increasing the minimum wage, or there was in 2017. And not only that, but it found that the majority of conservative voters, so even coalition voters, that's the Australian Conservative Party, believe that the minimum wage is too low. So you've got the press being lukewarm about the idea of a minimum wage being, neutral overall, and the public being strongly in favor of it. So there is a divergence. It's not as extreme as my first impression was, but there is a divergence. 77% of Labor voters believe that the wage should be higher, and 60% of Liberal National voters believe it should be higher. So it's actually quite something where there's bipartisan support in Australia for an increase of the minimum wage. Now, this other polling, which has happened last year, nearly a year ago, June of last year, didn't ask just whether you support it or not. It put in, do you believe that it will increase jobs or decrease jobs? So it wasn't just a straight yes, no. It was a more sophisticated and complicated question. And a similar number of people, those about 2/3 of voters, believe increasing the minimum wage will create jobs, a new poll has found. Also, the Reserve Bank did a study on the issue in last year, not long before that was found. And statistically, the Australian Reserve Bank, our central bank researcher, found that he was able to rule out adverse effect on hours worked, and also rule out that he found that wage increases do not have a statistically significant effect on the job destruction rate, said researcher James Bishop. If anything, the point estimate suggests that job destruction rate actually declines when the award wage is increased. So less people lose their jobs when the minimum wage goes up, according to the Reserve Bank. So you've got the Reserve Bank and the public on one side, business on the other, and the press neutral in the middle. And I'm going to write it up along those lines now.